The wind shifts just slightly, and the campfire smoke rolls directly into your face. Your eyes water instantly. You cough, step back, mutter something under your breath, and reposition your chair to the other side of the fire, the way every single person who has ever sat near a fire has done at some point without thinking twice about it. It's an annoyance, nothing more. A brief, unpleasant moment you'll forget by tomorrow. But for the overwhelming majority of the time, humans have existed on this planet, that exact moment. Smoke rolling into your face, your lungs filling with the combusted particles of burning plant matter, wasn't an occasional inconvenience at all. It was simply what breathing near other people looked like, every single night, for hundreds of thousands of years in a row. And somewhere in all of those countless nights of unavoidable smoke exposure, something changed. Somebody stopped treating it as something to escape and started treating it as something worth chasing on purpose. And that single shift, repeated independently across an entire species scattered over every inhabited continent, is the whole story we're about to walk through. Here's the actual scale of this behavior, worth sitting with for a moment. Deliberately inhaling smoke from a burning plant, for ritual, medicinal, or simply pleasurable reasons, shows up in the archaeological or written record of virtually every civilization historians have ever studied in any real depth. Ancient Egypt, ancient India, ancient China, ancient Greece, the Eurasian Steppe, and multiple independent civilizations across the Americas, none of which had any contact with one another when the practice first appears in their own record. That kind of independent repetition, across cultures separated by oceans and thousands of years, is exactly the pattern you'd expect if the underlying behavior traces back to something considerably older and more fundamental than any single culture's invention. Something closer to a shared discovery, made again and again by a species that had already been breathing smoke, one way or another, since long before it was fully human at all. Every culture that eventually turned it into ceremony, medicine, or ritual was, in a sense, simply catching up to something the species had already been doing by pure accident for a very long time. To understand where deliberate smoking actually comes from, you have to start considerably earlier than any pipe, brazier, or burial site. You have to start with fire itself, the oldest widely accepted evidence of controlled, sustained fire use comes from Wonderwerk Cave in South Africa, where archaeologists have found burnt plant ash and charred bone dating back roughly 1 million years. Evidence not of a passing wildfire, but of a contained fire maintained deliberately, inside a cave, over real time. The species responsible wasn't even Homo sapiens yet. It was Homo erectus, an earlier, smaller-brained ancestor, gathering around a controlled flame for warmth, for cooking, and for protection from the dark, exactly the way Tallo's own more recent ancestors would later do as well. Every single one of those early fire users, every night, for hundreds of thousands of years running, breathed in smoke as an unavoidable side effect of huddling close enough to a flame to actually benefit from its warmth and light. This wasn't a choice available to opt out of. It was simply the physical cost of staying warm and safe after dark, repeated so many times, across so many generations, that human lungs and human noses became thoroughly, deeply familiar with the specific experience of breathing combusted plant matter long before anyone had a reason to think of it as anything other than background discomfort. Some researchers studying the health effects of this constant ancestral exposure have even proposed that certain modern human respiratory adaptations may trace back, in part, to hundreds of thousands of years of near-continuous low-level smoke exposure around communal fires, a physical inheritance from an environmental condition that simply no longer applies to most people living indoors, with modern ventilation today. Here's where the story takes an interesting turn. Wood alone doesn't produce anything psychoactive when it burns, but the forests and grasslands early humans lived in weren't made of wood alone. They were full of other plants too, some of which released genuinely mind-altering compounds when their leaves, resin, or seeds happened to end up in a fire. Human bodies, it turns out, already had the necessary hardware in place to notice. The endocannabinoid system, a network of receptors spread throughout the brain and body that normally responds to chemical signals your own body produces naturally, also happens to respond to certain plant compounds released when specific plants are burned, absorbed rapidly through the lungs rather than more slowly through digestion. Some anthropologists have proposed that early humans living near such plants would have been repeatedly, accidentally, exposed to their smoke simply by building fires with whatever fuel happened to be locally available, occasionally noticing that a particular night's fire left them feeling distinctly different from an ordinary one. Nobody needed to understand any chemistry to notice that difference, or to start deliberately seeking out the same plants the next time a fire needed building. An accident, repeated often enough to be recognized as a pattern, is very often how deliberate behavior actually begins. It's worth pausing on how strange that origin story actually is. An entire category of ritual, medicine, and eventually global industry, tracing back not to any deliberate insight, but to the simple, repeated coincidence of certain plants growing close enough to human campsites to occasionally end up in the same fire people were already building every single night. Regardless, by the time we reach written history, the evidence stops being speculative and starts being remarkably specific. At a burial site high in the Pamir Mountains of Central Asia, archaeologists uncovered wooden braziers dating to roughly 500 BCE, still containing stones that had clearly been heated to high temperatures, alongside residue from cannabis plants with unusually high potency, far higher than the wild cannabis typically used for fiber or seed oil. This wasn't an incidental find. It was placed deliberately within a formal burial context, suggesting real ceremonial significance attached to the practice. Around the very same general era, the Greek historian Herodotus wrote a detailed account of the Scythians, a nomadic people of the Eurasian Steppe, describing small enclosed tents where they would heat stones and throw hemp seeds directly onto them. Then sit inside, inhaling the resulting smoke, reportedly with obvious vocal enjoyment. For centuries, historians treated this account with real skepticism, assuming Herodotus had exaggerated or simply misunderstood an unfamiliar foreign custom he'd witnessed secondhand. Then archaeologists began excavating Scythian burial mounds directly and found exactly what he'd described: bronze braziers, heat-cracked stones, and preserved hemp residue, matching his account in specific, verifiable detail. It turned out the ancient historian everyone had assumed was embellishing had simply been reporting accurately, something modern readers found difficult to believe. That reversal is worth sitting with on its own terms. For roughly 2,000 years, Herodotus's account was treated in Western scholarship as a colorful, probably exaggerated travel story, filed alongside his other, more fantastical claims about distant peoples. It took actual excavation, stone by stone, brazier by brazier, to restore his credibility on this one specific point. A reminder that the line between myth and overlooked fact is sometimes only as wide as whichever archaeologist hasn't dug in the right place yet. Tobacco itself tells an even older story than most people realize. In 2019, researchers excavating a hearth in the Great Salt Lake Desert of Utah found seeds from a wild tobacco species, concentrated in a pattern suggesting deliberate placement rather than accidental wind-blown scatter, inside a fire dated to roughly 12,000 years ago, significantly predating any known pipe or dedicated smoking artifact found anywhere in the region. That single hearth pushed the working timeline for intentional tobacco use back by a considerable margin, raising a genuinely fascinating question that extends well beyond tobacco itself. If people in North America were already placing this specific plant into fires 12,000 years ago, what were people on every other inhabited continent doing with whatever locally available psychoactive plants happened to grow in their own particular corner of the world? At that exact same moment in history, entirely independently, the desire to alter consciousness through inhaled smoke doesn't appear to belong to any single region, any single people, or any single plant. It appears to belong to the species as a whole, showing up wherever humans and the right plants happen to occupy the same landscape at the same time. What makes the Utah find particularly striking is the sheer age gap it opened up. 12,000 years is roughly the same span separating the invention of agriculture from the present day, meaning humans were already selecting and burning this specific plant deliberately before farming itself had even been invented anywhere on Earth. The behavior, in other words, isn't a byproduct of settled civilization at all. It considerably predates it. Long before smoke was treated as recreational, multiple independent civilizations treated it as medicine. The Ebers Papyrus, an Egyptian medical document dating to roughly 1550 BCE, describes inhaling smoke from specific heated herbs as a treatment for conditions affecting the throat and lungs. A genuinely counterintuitive idea by modern standards. And yet several of the herbs named do have measurable pharmacological effects when inhaled, which meant the underlying logic wasn't as far off as it might initially sound. Ancient Indian medical tradition describes a practice called dhumapana, literally meaning smoke drinking, involving specific herbs inhaled through pipes according to detailed, carefully refined protocols passed down across generations of trained physicians, matched to particular conditions, rather than used casually or interchangeably. Ancient Greek physicians practiced medicinal fumigation as well, treating inhaled herbal vapor as a legitimate way to deliver treatment directly to the lungs. 3 separate civilizations, with no meaningful contact between them, at the time these traditions developed, all arrived independently at roughly the same underlying insight: that smoke, delivered through the lungs, could carry a treatment into the body considerably faster than swallowing ever could. Modern medicine still quietly relies on that exact same basic principle every time an inhaler or a nebulizer delivers medication directly into someone's airway. It's a strange kind of continuity to sit with. The specific plants and preparations have changed almost entirely, replaced by precisely measured pharmaceutical compounds and calibrated delivery devices. But the underlying insight these 3 ancient medical traditions arrived at independently, that the lungs offer a uniquely fast, direct route into the body, has never actually been improved upon in any fundamental way. It was simply refined, generation after generation, until it became invisible enough to stop looking like ancient wisdom at all. Picture the scene Herodotus described, reconstructed from what archaeology later confirmed. A small tent, low and enclosed, has been pitched on the open steppe, its felt walls sealed tightly against the wind. Inside, a bronze brazier holds stones already heated to a deep, dull glow, radiating heat into the tight, enclosed space. A handful of hemp seeds are thrown directly onto the glowing stones, and the tent fills almost instantly with thick, fragrant smoke, trapped with nowhere to go but into the lungs of everyone gathered inside. There's no solitary ritual here. Several people sit together in the enclosed heat and smoke, sharing the same air, the same rising warmth, the same gradually shifting state of mind. Voices grow louder, laughter comes easier, the tight physical closeness of the tent itself becoming part of the experience alongside the smoke. Nobody in that tent is thinking about braziers, or Herodotus, or the fact that people 2,500 years later will still be debating whether this moment even happened at all. They're simply doing something that already felt to them like an old and thoroughly ordinary way to end a hard day on the open steppe. Sealed in together, breathing the same warm smoke, letting a shared fire do something to the whole group at once that no one of them could easily manage completely alone. Outside, the horses are tethered. The wind moves steadily across open grassland, stretching in every direction for miles. And inside this one small sealed tent, for a short while, None of that vast empty distance matters at all. What matters is the small, warm, smoke-filled space and the people sharing it. Here's the turn. For nearly the entire span of history we've just walked through, inhaled smoke was rare, deliberate, and wrapped tightly in ritual, medicine, or careful shared ceremony. Something requiring specific plants, specific preparation, and specific social context to access it all. Tobacco specifically remained entirely unknown outside the Americas until European contact in the late 15th century, at which point it was still being used by many indigenous cultures as something closer to sacred communication than casual habit, tied to healing, to binding agreements between groups, and to ceremonies connecting the living to the spirit world. What happened next? Once tobacco reached Europe, unfolded with startling speed. Within roughly a single century, it moved from an exotic curiosity to a continental fixture. Within a few centuries more, industrial manufacturing had turned it into a cheap, mass-produced consumer good, engineered deliberately for speed and intensity of effect rather than any ceremonial purpose at all. Internal industry research later revealed, decades after the fact, that manufacturers had understood the serious health risks associated with their products considerably earlier than they publicly admitted, and, in some documented cases, actively marketed those same products toward much younger consumers, regardless. A practice that once required an entire tribe's shared ritual knowledge, a burial's worth of ceremonial preparation, or a trained physician's careful protocol to access it all, had become, within a remarkably short span of centuries, something available at every corner store, stripped of nearly every piece of the social and spiritual context that used to surround it. The smoke itself never changed all that much. The container around it changed almost completely. Consider the actual time compression involved. Indigenous tobacco traditions in the Americas had roughly 10,000 years to develop the careful ritual boundaries surrounding their use. European industrial tobacco had roughly 400 years to strip nearly all of those boundaries away entirely, replacing generations of accumulated ceremonial knowledge with a product designed, quite deliberately in some well-documented cases, to bypass exactly the kind of restraint that ritual context used to provide automatically. You buy a pack at a counter without a second thought, the entire transaction taking less time than it took your ancestors to gather kindling for a single fire. They spent a decade training as a physician just to learn which specific herb, in which specific preparation, treated which specific ailment. One carefully documented protocol at a time. You associate this behavior with addiction, or bad habit, or a vice to feel quietly guilty about. They associated it with healing the sick, honoring the dead, and opening a channel to whatever they understood the divine to be. The smoke drifting from a modern cigarette and the smoke that once filled a sealed tent on the Eurasian Steppe are, in some documented cases, remarkably similar in their basic chemistry. Almost nothing else about the two experiences has anything in common at all. One took a physician a decade of careful training to responsibly administer. The other takes a corporate marketing department roughly 30 seconds of screen time to sell to somebody who has never once been taught to ask what, exactly, they're actually inhaling, or why some distant ancestor first thought it was worth the trouble to breathe in on purpose. The plant hasn't changed nearly as much as the distance between the person lighting it and the reason it was ever lit in the first place. This has been Foxholes. Stories from the Foxholes. The next time smoke drifts into your face uninvited, you'll know exactly how long humans have been arguing with themselves about whether to step away from it or lean in.